Welcome to the JMC True Crime channel. Thank you so much for joining me. Today's case, simply put, is about family. Or better yet, it's about blood relations. Sometimes those two things are not one and the same. Sometimes the very ones that should hold you dear are the ones that hold you in contempt. Today's story is about a young girl who experiences just that. So, strap in and let's get stuck in. Born on the 2nd of November 1991 was Victoria Adjo Kalimbié. Victoria was born in Abobo, which is a northern suburb of Abidjan along the Ivory Coast in Africa. Victoria was one of 7 children. In particular, she was the 5th. And being part of such a large family, you can imagine it may be easy to get lost in the shuffle, so to speak. But not Victoria. Victoria was loud and boisterous. She loved to sing and dance. She had a voice, and she loved to use it. She was a beautiful young girl. She had a smile that would light up a room. Her liveliness was actually one of the most definitive traits of Victoria's personality. Everyone would talk about this. Victoria's parents were Francis and Bert. Francis had an aunt called Marie-Therese Quau, and Marie lived in France. However, in October of 1998, 1 month before Victoria's 7th birthday, she came to visit the family. The reason for doing this is that she was attending her brother's funeral, and so she checked in on her nephew. Upon visiting the Kalimbié family, Marie offered to take one of their 7 children back with her to France. Doing this would allow them the opportunity for a better education and ideally get them a better start in life. This type of proposal was actually quite common in the family society, and with Victoria's parents, despite having only met Marie a few times, given that they are quite distant family members, they chose Victoria to go, and by all accounts, Victoria was overjoyed to be chosen. She knew what this meant. This meant that she could possibly have a better life. The family were extremely grateful that Victoria was going to get the opportunity to experience more of the world and likely succeed in whatever she would choose to do as she grew. What the family didn't know is that the Kalimbié family was not Marie's first choice when it came to picking a child to bring back with her to France. Initially, the plan was to bring back a little girl called Anna from a different family. She even went and had a passport made up with Anna's name and her picture, but when the time came to actually bring Anna, her parents declined. They didn't want her to go. And so Marie was left in that predicament of having a passport all ready to go, but no child to take with her. So that's why she went to the Kalimbié family, her nephew's family, and offered to take one of their children. From this point forward, Marie, fraudulently, would assert that Victoria was her daughter and that her name was Anna. In November of 1998, Marie took Victoria to Paris, France, and enrolled her in school. Now, if you've heard this story before, if you've heard of Victoria Kalimbié before, you likely know that this is a story centered on child abuse. I say this now because as we're going to cover Victoria's life and all that happened to her, or all that we know happened to her, I cannot specifically denote when the abuse began, only that it did. I theorised that it began either within weeks of Victoria being in Marie's custody, or perhaps immediately once Victoria was out of her parents' care. So, if we go back to November of 1998 and fast forward 1 month, I can confirm that Marie had already begun to receive warnings about Victoria's absenteeism from school. Bear in mind, it's only been 4 weeks and Victoria hadn't been attending school. That, knowing what we know now, is already a red flag. Because what was the reason? Victoria would be falling asleep in class, so evidently she's not getting enough sleep. Again, what was the reason? Marie would assert that Victoria's absence and her being overly tired was a result of a lack of discipline, that she was a naughty girl and she constantly misbehaved at home. This, however, was contradictory to how Victoria's teachers knew her to be, At school, she was perfectly behaved and she did really well. And so this did get them thinking that perhaps something was afoot. Perhaps something wasn't quite right in the home. In February of 1999, so 4 months since Victoria had been enrolled in the school, they issued a child at risk notification and a social worker became involved, though not much came of this. Nothing did, actually. The head teacher would later recall that Marie had once advised the school that Victoria suffered from a really bad skin condition, and so 1 month later, in March of 1999, they noted that Victoria had come to school with a shaven head and was wearing a wig. Now, there can be plenty of valid reasons for a child to need to shave their head and wear a wig, but this, along with the other red flags that Marie had exhibited, again, left questions. The day that the head teacher had seen Victoria in the wig, which was the 25th of March 1999, was also the last day that Victoria would attend that school. And 1 month later, on the 24th of April 1999, Marie and Victoria had left Paris and relocated in the UK, where they eventually settled in Ealing, West London. Unironically, there was more than just one reason as to why Marie wanted to flee. Not only was the school asking questions that she couldn't answer without letting the cat out of the bag, so to speak, she also was in trouble with the French government. She owed them £2,000 after wrongly being paid child benefit, as well as having been evicted from her home because she wasn't paying the rent. Upon arrival to the UK, they stayed in a hotel, specifically a bed and breakfast, and then a few weeks would pass before they then had to stay in a hostel. Marie and Victoria visited a distant relative of Marie's through marriage, named Esther Acker. Esther was a midwife, preacher, and a counsellor. Victoria, despite knowing her real name, did respond to the name Anna. This is what she had been briefed to do by Marie. And of course, you'll remember the whole situation with the passport. The way that Marie had been able to take Victoria out of the country was using that fake passport that she had initially intended for a young girl named Anna. Of course, that plan did fall through, and as we know, Victoria was her backup. It didn't take Esther very long to become slightly suspicious. She noted how Victoria was quite small and frail, and she found out that Victoria was wearing a wig. And when she took the wig from Victoria's head, she saw that her head was covered in blisters. And when she confronted Marie, Marie would assert that there had been some hot water accident, that it was no big deal. Because Esther had no real reason to doubt Marie, and Victoria appeared to be happy, she let it go. From the 26th of April to July of 1999, Marie would visit Ealing Social Services at least 18 times for housing and financial purposes. Now, Victoria was with her on most occasions, and whilst she was there, most of the staff would note how Victoria looked. She looked dirty, she looked unkempt. One staff member even thought she looked like a child from an ActionAid advertisement. ActionAid is an international organisation whose primary aim is to work against poverty and injustice worldwide. So, if the staff thought she looked like a child from this ad, why didn't they say anything or do anything? Well, I'll tell you why. They thought that Marie was purposefully dressing Victoria like this for sympathy, so that they would rule in her favour and give her what she wanted. I do appreciate that hindsight is 2020, and so I don't want to be judgmental, but it does appear that they didn't dare consider the thought that this was merely a child who needed help. On the 8th of June 1999, Marie got a job at Northwick Park Hospital. She was working full-time, and while she was at work, she left Victoria in the home. She didn't have any supervision, she didn't have anyone to talk to play with, nothing. And this was a 7-year-old girl. She also made no effort to enroll Victoria in school. Also in June of that year, Marie took Victoria to a local general practitioner surgery, and while she was there, the practice nurse didn't carry out any physical examination because Victoria hadn't been reported to have any health problems at that time. But looking back, this is another moment where maybe something could have been done. By the middle of June, Victoria was actually spending most of her time with Priscilla Cameron, who was a childminder, and by all accounts, she was really happy when she was in Priscilla's home. She was treated really well, and she just got to be what she was, which was a little girl. She got to play, she got to sing, she got to dance, she got to laugh. All things that she did not get to experience whilst she was with Marie. Priscilla observed that Victoria had small cuts on her fingers, and when she asked Marie about it, Marie would say that Victoria liked to play with blades. Now I've just got to say, that sounds ridiculous. Why would a 7-year-old want to play with blades? And if that's true, let's, play with me for a minute here. If that's true, why are you letting her play with blades? As an adult, you know that's a danger, so why are you allowing it? A few days later, Marie and Victoria met up with Esther, and Esther noted a scar on Victoria's cheek, and when she asked Marie about it, Marie's response? She fell on an escalator. Typical things. But not so typical to Esther. 3 days from then, Esther planned to come and see them in the hostel to see what their living situation was like, and when she did visit them, she noted that Victoria had appeared to have lost even more weight and appeared weaker than before. She also noted that she wasn't in school, and she just generally seemed like she wasn't being taken care of, and Esther was right to think that. Esther also took action. On the 18th of June, she anonymously called social services and expressed extreme concern over Victoria's situation. Esther urgently requested that someone look into this. She knew that something wasn't quite right. The person that picked up her phone call was Samantha Hunt, a customer service officer. She took notes detailing all of Esther's concerns and faxed the referral to the Children's Social Work Department on that same day. However, no one in the appropriate team picked up that referral, meaning that absolutely nothing was done. A few days later, Esther called back, wanting to make sure that her concerns had been heard, and the person that answered that phone call said that social services had probably done something about it. But as we know, they hadn't. And this second call that Esther had made did not trigger a new referral, nor did it even allow for an update on the first one. It wasn't until 3 weeks later, on the 6th of July, that the first referral was finally seen. Now, 3 weeks may not seem like a lot of time, but when we're talking about child abuse, 3 weeks is too much time. Now, back in June, Marie and Victoria had met Carl Manning, who was a bus driver. Carl was 26 years old at the time, and Marie was 42, so quite the age difference there. Nevertheless, they quickly began a romantic relationship. Marie was actually Carl's first girlfriend, and so their relationship developed very quickly, and on the 6th of July, Victoria and Marie had moved into his one-bedroom flat in Tottenham. Now, back to social services. On the 7th of July, Brent Social Services had sent a letter to Nickel Road, where Marie and Victoria had been staying, to inform them of a home visit, and 1 week later, 2 social workers, Laurie Hobbs and Monica Bridgman, visited the address, but there was no answer. Of course, we know why that was, because Marie and Victoria had moved and were now living with Carl in Tottenham. The 2 social workers, however, did not know this, nor did they make any attempt to find out. Prior to the visit, they hadn't done any background checks and barely even knew what they were investigating. Again, not trying to be judgmental, but this does sound a lot like incompetence. The only thing they did do was to add onto the report, "Not at this address, have moved." And who knows, maybe if they had followed it up, Victoria's story would be a different one. On the 13th of July, Marie took Victoria back to Priscilla, asking her to take Victoria permanently. The reason for this? Because Carl didn't want her. They had only been living with Carl for a week at this point, and he already decided that he didn't want a child in his company, despite knowing that Victoria was part of the deal. Nevertheless, it's easy to wish that that was the outcome, that Victoria would be away from people that didn't want her and in the company of perhaps someone that did. But sadly, that's not what happened. At the end of the day, Priscilla is a childminder. She already had 2 kids of her own. She couldn't take on another. And even if she didn't have 2 children of her own, again, she was a childminder. She didn't sign on to become a parent to somebody else's child. And that's completely understandable. But what she did do was agree to take Victoria for the night. And I can only imagine and hope that that one night brought some solace for Victoria. During this night, Priscilla, her son Cameron, and her daughter Avril all saw that Victoria had numerous injuries, including a burn on her face and a loose piece of skin hanging from her right eyelid. Marie said this was self-inflicted, which I think is absurd. Carl, however, had a different story. He said that he had hit Victoria, beginning with slapping her and eventually progressing to using his fists. Victoria would be admitted to the hospital on 2 separate occasions, both within the month of July. The first occasion took place on the 14th of July, as Priscilla's daughter Avril took Victoria to A&E, which is the Accident and Emergency Department at Central Middlesex Hospital. When Victoria was asked about her injuries, she did say they were self-inflicted, and it's easy to understand why. The poor thing must have been absolutely terrified to say anything out of turn from fear of the consequences. The paediatrician that had been examining Victoria, Dr. Ajay Obi, did not believe that this was credible. Her injuries, they just didn't look self-inflicted. And this paediatrician was correct. They were not. So, she decided to admit Victoria into the ward. The doctors called the police and social services, and Marie would tell the doctors that Victoria simply had scabies. For those that don't know, scabies, it's also known as the 7-year itch. It's a contagious skin infestation. Ruby Schwartz, who was the consultant paediatrician, diagnosed Victoria with scabies and said that scratching is what caused the injuries. However, she made this diagnosis without speaking to Victoria, without examining Victoria. She made this diagnosis on the foundation of nothing and gave validity to Marie's lies. This is another moment where Victoria's story, Victoria's life, could have taken a different path, but it didn't. After that pivotal moment initiated by Ruby Schwartz, it all kind of went downhill from there in terms of all the alert and suspicion that had been raised dwindled. A child protection officer who was going to investigate the case decided not to because they saw Ruby Schwartz's judgment and decided to trust it. The police officer that had been allocated to Victoria's case decided to remove the police protection that had been ordered, and Victoria was allowed to go home to the home where she was being tortured. This all happened within about 24 hours. On the 14th of July, Victoria actually had some protection. Social services were on alert, the police were on alert, and then on the 15th of July, the very next day, she was back to being unprotected. She was back to being a defenseless little girl. Victoria's second hospital admission took place on the 24th of July, so only 9 days since her first one. Although this time she was admitted to North Middlesex Hospital, possibly to avoid any suspicion that may be raised, given that she's being admitted for the second time within 9 days. With this second admission, Victoria was admitted with severe scalding to both her head and her face. The hospital also found no evidence of scabies. Apparently, one consultant, Mary Rossiter, even noted that Victoria was exhibiting signs of neglect, emotional and physical abuse. Despite that, though, she still wrote a note stating that Victoria was able to discharge. Social services were once again alerted, and eventually Victoria's case was passed to Haringey Council. A social worker from the council, Lisa Arthurworry, and a police officer, Karen Jones, were assigned to Victoria's case. They were even scheduled to make a home visit on the 4th of August. However, they cancelled the visit because they heard about Victoria's scabies, despite the fact that Victoria did not have scabies. At this point, it just sounds like Chinese whispers. On the 5th of August, Marie met up with the social worker and the police officer to claim that Victoria had poured boiling hot water over herself to stop the itching that had been caused by the scabies. And then she said that Victoria had used utensils to cause the other injuries. As ridiculous as this may sound to me, and maybe you as well, it didn't sound ridiculous to Lisa Arthworry and Karen Jones. They believed Marie, deciding that the injuries were most likely accidental, and then allowed Victoria to go home. From this moment on, Marie kept Victoria away from hospitals, and instead went to churches. Marie would say that there were demons inside of Victoria, and one pastor even suspected that Victoria was being abused, but he took no action. That seems par for the course at this point. From October of 1999 to at least January of 2000, Victoria was being forced to sleep in the bath using a bin liner as a cover and surrounded by her own excrement. Carl would later say that this was because Victoria would frequently wet the bed, and children wet the bed. It's not necessarily a sign of something sinister, but in Victoria's case, it absolutely was. And Carl was one of the two people causing her pain. On the 1st of November, Marie told social workers that Carl had been sexually assaulting Victoria, and then she withdrew the accusation the following day. Regardless, it's certainly not difficult to believe that this was true. Another way for Carl and Marie to torture Victoria. This accusation by Marie came very shortly after a visit from Lisa Arthworry, the social worker in Victoria's case. Lisa had told Marie that the council could only house children that were at serious risk, and an accusation like this would place Victoria into that category. Carl would later deny the allegation. Between December and January, Lisa would make 3 visits to the flat, but there was no answer. She spoke with her supervisor, Carol Baptiste, believing that they had returned to France, and despite having absolutely no evidence for this to be true, Carol Baptiste wrote on Victoria's file that they had left the area. On the 18th of February 2000, they wrote to Marie stating if they did not receive any contact, they would close the case. And on the 25th of February 2000, they did just that. The 25th of February 2000 was a monumental day. Victoria's case was ended, and her life was too. The day before, on the 24th of February 2000, Victoria was taken whilst unconscious and suffering from hypothermia, multiple organ failure, and malnutrition to the local Universal Church of the Kingdom of God. The pastor rightfully said that Victoria should be taken to a hospital, and so a minicab was called. The minicab driver was absolutely horrified at Victoria's condition. She looked terrible. The minicab driver took her to the nearest ambulance station, and she was immediately rushed to the A&E department and then transferred over to the ICU, which is the intensive care unit. And the whole time, Marie is going, my baby, trying to be convincing and to show that she actually cared about Victoria. The following day, the 25th of February, at 3:15 p.m, Victoria succumbed to her injuries. The pathologist who examined her noted 128 separate injuries and scars on her body and described it as the worst case of child abuse she had ever seen. Victoria, an 8-year-old girl, had been bound, burned, scalded, starved, and beaten. She was buried in Grand Bassam, which is a town in southeastern Ivory Coast, lying east of Abidjan, so very close to where she was born. Marie was arrested on that very day, and Carl the following day. And Marie did her best to try and extract some sympathy, but she failed. All you have to do is look at Victoria's small, frail, weak body, and that's enough. And the truth is, that should have been enough when she was still breathing. Because if it had been, she would still be breathing now. On the 20th of November 2000, at the Old Bailey, which is the Central Criminal Court of England and Wales, the trial began. Both Marie and Carl were charged with child cruelty and murder. Marie denied all charges, which is not a surprise to me, and Carl pled guilty to child cruelty and manslaughter. The judge, rightfully so, in my opinion at least, described the people in Victoria's case as blindingly incompetent. On the 12th of January 2001, both of them were found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. We've spoken about Victoria's life and now her death, but the reality is I couldn't possibly tell you everything she went through because I don't know everything she went through. Only Marie and Carl know exactly what they did to that little girl. From my research, I can confirm that they burnt her with cigarettes, they starved her, they tied her up, they hit her with bike chains, with hammers, wires, shoes, belt buckles, their bare hands. And when they would feed her, on the odd occasion they gave her such a luxury, she would be forced to eat like a dog. They would throw the food at her and make her catch it in her mouth. Marie and Carl were sentenced to life imprisonment, but that does not compare to what they subjected Victoria to. In 2003, a UK government initiative for England and Wales was launched called Every Child Matters, or ECM, and Victoria is largely the reason why. And the same goes for the Children Act of 2004. As you can imagine, after Victoria's death, there was a lot of public criticism once the facts were discovered. How did it get to this point? Why was nothing done? Why was Victoria left in that home? A public inquiry was made, and it was this inquiry where a host of inadequacies were uncovered. Victoria could have and should have been saved. With regards to Victoria's parents, they received 3 messages from Marie the entire time she had Victoria, and all 3 of them said that Victoria was in good health. And that's all they got to know until they learnt of their daughter's death. Victoria's short life is as devastating as it is infuriating, because there were so many missed opportunities, so many chances to help her, and so many, all of them really, were lost. Victoria lived for 8 short years, and her final year of life was a tortured one. Throughout this episode, I definitely feel that I've expressed a lot of displeasure for how defenceless and unprotected Victoria was, and I do feel it equally important to remind you that there were people that tried to help her. Look at Priscilla Cameron, look at Esther Acker. It was the lack of action from others that failed Victoria. So as you go about your life, if you see something, do say something. Be a Priscilla, be an Esther. Well, Thank you to everyone that stuck around so long. I really appreciate it. Make sure you subscribe, make sure you like, and make sure you comment. Really appreciate the engagement, and it does help to get further visibility, and that will just allow us to make more content over here at the channel. So, I'll be catching you all soon. Peace.